The stadium was trembling, not metaphorically, not in the exaggerated way journalists sometimes describe buzz or energy. The concrete foundation itself shuddered under the force of tens of thousands of feet stomping, clapping, moving in restless anticipation. The air felt thick, charged with static, like the sky before a thunderstorm. And yet, instead of rain, what broke was a sound. 50,000 voices surging together in one tidal chant. Michael, Michael, Michael. The name didn't just echo, it shook. It rolled to the open-air structure like a living pulse, vibrating the steel scaffolding that held up the lights, rattling the seats, finding its way into the bones of every person lucky enough to be inside. 1,000 different accents, pitches, and tones blended into one booming cry, a sound so loud that even the circling news helicopters above had to rise higher just to avoid the distortion of the noise. And then the lights went black. The collective scream that followed was almost violent. People leapt to their feet, phones raised like glowing stars. The screens of camcorders, those clunky, boxy shapes of the late 80s and early 90s, dotted the stands like fireflies. For a moment, the stadium became a galaxy of flashing red dots and shaky camera lights. A single spotlight ripped through the darkness, cutting a clean white blade across the stage. There he was, Michael Jackson. The sequins on his black military jacket burst to life under the beam, scattering light like shattered glass across the crowd. His gloved hand flicked up just slightly, and the crowd screamed as if they'd been personally chosen. He didn't need words. He didn't need to move. Just standing there, silhouetted in white fire, Michael controlled an empire of sound. The band snapped in, a thunderous drumbeat shaking the stadium, bass lines thick as jet engines, guitars snarling into life. And Michael, suddenly impossibly moved, a glide, sharper than logic should allow, cutting from one end of the stage to the other. The crowd surged forward like a wave breaking against a seawall. Fans reached, clawed, strained as though their fingertips might catch a fragment of the light, bouncing from his jacket. He spun once, hat low, and the air itself seemed to bend toward him. The show had begun. Every detail was cinematic. Flames shot up at the edge of the stage, crackling heat against the night air. Towers of light strobed in sync with the music, painting the stadium in bursts of red, gold, and electric blue. Michael's every move was a dialogue between body and sound, a snap of the wrist timed perfectly with a cymbal crash, a tilt of the head pulling screams out of throats as if he were a puppeteer. But amid the chaos, something happened. It came so faintly at first that even Michael wondered if he had imagined it. A voice, not a scream, not the usual chorus of "I love you" or "Michael," that flooded every pause. No, this was different. Softer, sharper, clearer, like a thread of silver weaving its way through the blanket of noise. Michael's head turned slightly, almost instinctively. His body kept moving, spinning in practiced rhythm, but his eyes scanned the darkness beyond the lights. Thousands of faces, blurred into a single organism by the distance and haze. And yet there was again that voice. The music thundered on. His dancers leapt into position beside him, the choreography flawless. But Michael's attention was split. He leaned into the mic, voice slicing to the wall of sound, and the crowd erupted as he hit the opening line of the song. But inside, something gnawed at him. He had heard something that didn't belong, something out of place, something human. The roar of the crowd masked it from everyone else. But Michael had spent his life training his ears to catch the faintest cues. A misplaced note in rehearsal, the subtle drag of a drum beat, a microphone that wasn't switched on fast enough. His whole career was built on perfection, on listening harder than anyone else could. That's why this pierced him so deeply. He shouldn't have heard it, and yet he had. He slid across the stage in a perfect moonwalk, his shoes whispering against the glossy black surface. The stadium exploded. Fireworks cracked overhead. But Michael's heart was racing for a different reason. His eyes, shielded under the brim of his fedora, kept darting toward one side of the arena. He couldn't see clearly past the blinding floodlights, but he knew. The voice was there. The crowd surged again, and the chant returned louder than before. Michael, Michael. Thousands of people chanting, roaring, desperate for more. And yet, to him, it was almost muted, All he could hear was that single thread of sound buried deep within the storm. For a flicker of a second, he faltered. The band didn't notice. The audience thought it was part of the act. But Michael knew he had missed a beat. Just barely. He snapped back into rhythm with surgical precision, but his chest was tight. His mind wasn't on the dance anymore. He was searching. What was it? Who was it? A fan's cry? A child's voice? A memory breaking through the noise? He couldn't place it, but it was real. Too real to dismiss. The sound carried weight, like it was meant for him alone. It wasn't begging. It wasn't worshiping. It wasn't noise. It was something far more dangerous. Something personal. And as the song reached its first chorus, as the crowd surged into a familiar rhythm of clapping and screaming, Michael's eyes darted again toward the far section of the stadium. Somewhere out there, among tens of thousands, one voice had broken through the storm, and Michael Jackson couldn't let it go. The opening act ended not with triumph, but with a question. He lifted his head, sweat already glistening under the lights, chest heaving with the effort of performance. The crowd roared back, a wall of devotion crashing into him. He smiled, but it was smaller, tighter than usual. Inside, his thoughts were racing. He had heard a voice in the crowd, and it was about to change everything. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. Michael Jackson had spent his entire life in noise, from the days of his childhood in Gary, Indiana, where his father's stern voice drilled rhythm into him before he even understood what childhood was, to the screaming seas of fans that greeted him in every city. His world had been filled with sound. Screams, applause, rehearsals, arguments, interviews, whispers in tabloids, an ocean of constant, relentless noise. But tonight, amid 50,000 throats straining to reach him, amid the pounding bass and screaming guitars, a single, fragile thread of sound had cut through. He could still hear it. He sang the next verse flawlessly, at least to the fans' ears, but in his mind, the words felt detached, automatic, like muscle memory carrying him forward while his heart was elsewhere. His eyes darted past the blinding spotlights again. Somewhere in the left corner, past the crush of fans pressed against the barriers, was where he thought it had come from. The sound had been too pure, too raw, not the shrill desperation of a fan screaming, "I love you," with tears streaming down their face. Not the competitive shouting of thousands vying to be noticed. This had been different, gentle, almost, a voice that carried weight, like it had a message only he was meant to hear. Between songs, he paused, catching his breath. The crowd erupted into chant again, thousands of arms stretched toward him like branches reaching for the sun. To them, this was a pause of drama, part of performance. But backstage, his band and crew exchanged looks. Michael rarely stopped for this long. "Is he okay?" one of the guitarists whispered to the drummer. "Yeah, maybe he's just milking it," came the uncertain reply. But Michael wasn't milking anything. He was scanning, searching. His gloved hand shielded his eyes from the glare of the lights as he peered into the dark rows of the arena. Nothing but a blur of faces, endless waves of people moving, screaming, crying. He couldn't see clearly, but he swore he could feel it, like that one voice had left an imprint on him, a thread tugging at his chest. The band kicked into the next song, and Michael snapped back into motion. His body obeyed its lifelong training, every pop, lock, and glide hitting with mathematical precision. But his heart wasn't on autopilot anymore. He was listening. With every step, every note, he strained his ears past the crowd. Most artists would have been swallowed whole by that tidal wave of noise, but not Michael. He had a musician's ear tuned beyond normal limits, capable of picking out the faintest echo in chaos. And there it was again, faint and possibly faint, but real, a small voice calling out his name. Not a scream, not hysteria, but almost a plea. Michael stumbled for half a beat, catching himself instantly with a spin so fluid the crowd gasped and cheered, assuming it was deliberate. But his heart pounded harder. He wasn't imagining it. He knew now the voice was real. As the song built to its chorus, the usual wall of sound rose from the crowd. Tens of thousands belted lyrics with him, their collective roar shaking the rafters. But in that tidal wave, Michael still heard the thread. Clear, pure. It shook him in a way he couldn't explain. For decades, fans had shouted his name until their voices broke, desperate to be noticed. But this wasn't desperation. This was something else. It wasn't asking for him. It wasn't demanding anything. It was reaching. A voice filled with love, gratitude, and something deeper, almost spiritual. He felt his chest tighten as a memory rose unbidden. Himself at 10 years old, clutching a microphone too big for his hand, looking out at an audience for the first time and thinking, can it even hear me? Do I matter? His whole life had been shaped by voices around him, voices telling him to push harder, sing louder, perform better, never stop. But this voice in the crowd, it wasn't telling him to do anything. It was simply speaking to him, as if to remind him that behind the spectacle, behind the legend, there was still Michael. And that nearly undid him. The song ended with a burst of fireworks, the crowd screaming louder than ever. Michael bent forward, hands on his knees, catching his breath. Sweat beaded down his face, shimmering under the lights. To the audience, it looked like exhaustion. To Michael, it was the weight of that voice pressing on his chest. He stood again, hand over his heart, and the stadium roared. But his gaze never left that shadowy corner of the crowd. Did you hear that? He whispered to his stage manager as he passed near the edge. Hear what, Mike? Michael shook his head. Of course no one else had noticed. To them, it was just chaos. To him, it was a beacon. As the next intro began, Michael gripped the microphone tighter than usual. His voice came out strong, flawless, but his mind was distracted. Every line he sang, he wondered if the voice would return. Every pause in the music, he leaned into the silence, listening. And then it happened. Between verses, as the music softened, the voice rang out again. Clearer now. A young voice, a child's voice. Michael, we love you. Michael froze for half a beat, then swallowed hard. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they were said. Honest, gentle, without expectation, pure. He blinked, and for a moment, the stage lights seemed to blur. His throat tightened. This wasn't part of the show. This wasn't a moment he could choreograph. This was real, raw, unfiltered humanity breaking through the machine of spectacle. And Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the man who had perfected every detail of his stagecraft, suddenly found himself shaken by something no rehearsal could prepare him for. His voice faltered just slightly as he sang the next line. Only a trained ear would notice, but Michael noticed. It wasn't weakness. It was emotion. The crowd didn't understand yet. They screamed louder, thinking he was overcome by the sheer size of the moment. But in truth, Michael wasn't hearing them at all. He was listening for that one small, fragile voice in the dark. And he knew, deep in his heart, that before this night was over, he couldn't ignore it. He would have to stop. He would have to answer. The thought terrified him, and yet it felt inevitable. The third song of the set was supposed to be flawless. It was one of Michael's crown jewels, a performance he delivered hundreds of times across the world, polished to perfection. Each beat choreographed like clockwork. The band was locked in. The dancers were fire and precision. The audience was at its peak, 50,000 people swaying and shouting in a collective fever dream. But Michael's mind wasn't with them anymore. He had spent the last half hour dancing with ghosts, not the kind that haunted him in the tabloids, not the way to fame, but the ghost of that voice. It had pierced him again and again like a needle through silk, threading its way into every lyric he sang. Each time he thought maybe he imagined it, the voice returned, stubborn, clear, undeniable. And then it happened during the third chorus. He heard it again, louder this time, during a rare break in the music. A child's voice, fragile but caring, somehow leaping over the screams of 50,000. Michael, I love you. It wasn't shrill. It wasn't desperate. It was pure, like a prayer whispered into the sky. Michael's chest seized. His voice caught in his throat. And then, for the first time in years, he stopped. The band crashed on, guitars roaring, drums pounding, but their leader wasn't with them anymore. Michael froze mid-step, one foot poised forward in a dance move he performed 1,000 times, and stayed there. His microphone lowered, his lips pressed together. The dancers faltered, unsure whether to continue. They glanced at each other nervously. Backstage, the stage manager yelled into his headset, "Stay on it. Keep playing. He'll pick it back up." But he didn't. Michael raised his hand, suddenly palm out, the international gesture of stop. The band slowed, confused. Drums stumbled to silence. Guitars trailed off into feedback. Keyboards cut out mid-chord. One by one, the instruments died until the only sound left in the stadium was the deafening roar of the crowd. 50,000 people screaming. Screaming because something had gone wrong. Michael Jackson never stopped the show. Not for broken sound systems, not for pyrotechnics gone awry, not even for exhaustion. His shows were sacred rituals of precision. But here he was, standing at center stage, silent. And then he lifted the microphone again. The noise simmered, still a hurricane, but tinged now with confusion. His voice cut through the air, softer than anyone expected. "I hear you." The words echoed across the stadium, carried on the PA system like a secret suddenly shared with thousands. The crowd gasped. Who was he talking to? Everyone screamed louder, believing he was talking to them. But Michael shook his head. He turned, pointing toward the left-hand corner of the stadium, toward the shadowy section where he'd been staring all night. "No," he said again, firmer this time. "I hear you." A spotlight swiveled in confusion, following the line of his gloved finger. It cut across the sea of faces, blinding some, catching others in its cone. Fans shielded their eyes. Others waved frantically, desperate to be the one noticed. But Michael wasn't scanning wildly. His gaze was locked, fixed like a magnet to that one corner. The stadium, still screaming, began to quiet. A strange hush fell, like an audience sensing it was part of something larger than itself. The roar of 50,000 slowly broke into ripples of murmurs, gasps, silence. Michael stood there, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling beneath the sequin jacket. Sweat glistened on his face. His curls stuck damply to his forehead. He wasn't playing a role now. He wasn't the king of pop, untouchable and larger than life. He was a man listening for something beyond the noise. And then it came. The voice again. Small, cracked, but audible now in the cavernous quiet he'd carved from chaos. "Michael, don't stop believing." The words were childlike, innocent, and they carried through the microphone pickups. Faint but unmistakable. The cameras didn't catch the child yet, but those close to the section turned their heads. Some saw a small figure standing on a seat, hands cupped to their mouth, face lit by tears reflecting the stage lights. Michael staggered back a half step. His throat tightened. For a man who had built his empire on performing without falter, without weakness, he suddenly felt undone. The crowd reacted like a living creature. Gasps rippled. Some screamed. Others cried. Michael brought the microphone back to his lips, his voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "I hear you, sweetheart." The stadium exploded. The eruption wasn't the usual scream of adoration. It was cathartic, emotional, like thousands of people suddenly realized they were part of something bigger than a show. The spotlight locked onto the section now, finally catching the small figure. A child, maybe 9 or 10, clutching a handmade sign that had been crumpled in the rush of the crowd. Their voice had been the one slicing to the storm all night. Their face crumpled in disbelief as the man they worshipped had stopped the world just to answer them. Michael sank to his knees at the edge of the stage, leaning forward, reaching out a trembling hand. He wasn't thinking of cameras, of headlines, of anything except the purity of that voice. He lowered his head, eyes wet, and smiled. For the first time in decades, Michael Jackson wasn't giving a performance. He was living a moment. Backstage, chaos erupted. Crew members panicked. "Get the band back on. Keep the show rolling," one barked into a headset. But the others knew. This wasn't something you rushed. This wasn't part of the script. This was lightning in a bottle, the kind of moment fans would tell their grandchildren about. The arena was silent now except for soft crying, gasps, and the muffled sobs of the child in the spotlight. Michael raised the microphone again, his voice breaking. "Don't you ever stop believing. Not in me, but in you." The words poured out unscripted, raw. And in that moment, 50,000 people felt something they couldn't describe. The tearing down of walls, the collapse of distance between icon and audience, legend and human. The show had stopped, but something greater had begun. The silence was electric. Tens of thousands of fans had gone still, as though they collectively agreed that breathing too loudly might shatter the fragile magic hanging in the air. Michael Jackson, kneeling at the edge of the stage, wasn't a performer anymore. He wasn't the king of pop. He was simply a man listening, really listening, to someone no one else in the arena could hear until he forced them to. The spotlight pinned the child now, a small figure standing on a folding stadium seat, tears glistening down their cheeks. Their voice, impossibly clear for someone so small, wavered again. "Michael, don't stop believing." The words, simple as they were, carried like scripture. They echoed to the steel beams of the stadium, resonated in the bones of the fans, and struck Michael like an arrow to the chest. For so long, he had lived in a world where people demanded something from him. Adoration, autographs, miracles of performance, perfection on demand. But this child wasn't asking for anything. They weren't begging him to sing their favorite song or reach for their hand. They were giving something instead. Hope, love, a reminder. Michael pressed a microphone to his lips, his voice soft, trembling, dangerously close to breaking. "I hear you," he whispered again. The crowd erupted into sobs and cheers, a strange mixture of both. People clutched one another in disbelief. Strangers hugged, overcome by the intimacy of the moment. Grown men cried openly in the stands. Michael's hand extended outward, fingers trembling in their iconic white glove, reaching as though it alone could bridge the vast gulf between stage and crowd. Security guards instinctively braced, ready to intervene, but then froze. Even they knew this wasn't a moment they could interfere with. The child, still standing on the seat, stretched both arms forward, as though offering themselves entirely. Their sign, clutched tightly, slipped from their grip and floated down into the crush of people below. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Michael saw them, heard them. "Sweetheart," Michael said, his voice steadying just enough to carry across the sound system. "You've got the biggest heart in this whole place." The child sobbed, overwhelmed. The crowd roared again, but it wasn't hysteria. It was love, amplified 1,000-fold. A wave of energy rolled back and forth through the stands, an invisible thread binding everyone together. And then Michael did something nobody expected. He motioned for the band to stay silent. No music, no backbeat, nothing. He wanted the night to belong to this moment alone. He leaned closer to the crowd, balancing precariously on the lip of the stage, and cupped the microphone to his lips again. "This show isn't about me," he said, breathless. "It's about all of you, every voice, every soul. And tonight, one voice reminded me why I'm here." The fans gasped. Many broke into tears. Some covered their mouths, whispering, "Did you hear that? He's talking to the kid." The child shouted again, voice cracking with emotion, "We believe in you, Michael." Michael's hand flew to his chest. He bowed his head, visibly shaken. His shoulders trembled, and for a moment, it seemed like he might collapse entirely under the weight of emotion. When he raised his face again, there were tears in his eyes. Real, unhidden, human. The cameras projecting his image onto the Jumbotron screens caught every detail. The shine of sweat, the glisten of tears, the fragile smile trembling on his lips. 50,000 people saw the man behind the myth, and the sight melted them. "You believe in me," he said softly, his voice breaking. "But I want you to promise me something." The crowd went utterly still. A pin could have dropped, and it would have echoed. "Promise me," Michael said, locking eyes with the child in the spotlight, "that you'll never stop believing in yourself, because that's the most important voice in the world. Yours." The words detonated like a bomb of love inside the stadium. People screamed. Others sobbed. A woman in the front row fainted into the arms of her husband. 2 teenagers held each other, shaking with tears. A grown man, a father, later swore he'd never forget the way those words changed him forever. Michael stood slowly, rising to his full height, chest heaving, hands still pressed his heart. He looked out over the endless sea of faces, but in his eyes there was only one small figure who had broken through the hurricane of noise. "Music," he said, sweeping his hand out to the crowd, "isn't about fame. It isn't about lights. It's about love. And tonight you gave me love." He pointed once more to the child, then lifted the microphone high above his head. The crowd answered instantly, thousands of voices fusing together in a roar so thunderous it shook the very foundations of the stadium. But this roar was different from the chants before. This one wasn't just fandom, it was unity, gratitude, an outpouring of shared humanity. Michael smiled through his tears. He turned to the band and gave a single nod. The drummer lifted his sticks but waited. Michael turned back to the child, giving one last nod of acknowledgement. The child, overcome, pressed their hands together in a prayer gesture, tears streaming down their face. Michael mirrored the gesture, bowing his head briefly, as though sealing a covenant between them. And then the music returned. But the concert had changed forever. When the band launched back into the next song, the energy was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Every lyric Michael sang was drenched in raw emotion. His voice cracked in places, but it didn't matter. In fact, it only made the performance more powerful. Each note carried the weight of the moment he had just lived, the truth he had just spoken. Fans sang louder than ever, harmonizing with him, as though the entire stadium had become his choir. He was no longer singing to them. He was singing with them. Backstage, one of his backup singers whispered to another, "He's not performing anymore. He's testifying." And that's what it felt like. A testimony. Every leap, every spin, every belted chorus felt reborn, infused with new life. The connection between artist and audience had transcended spectacle. It was no longer about choreography, about perfection. It was about love. Michael knew it. The crowd knew it. And the child, still standing on the seat, trembling with joy, knew it most of all. The moment of connection had changed the night, and it was only going to grow. The stadium had shifted. An hour earlier, it had been a temple of noise, of spectacle, the kind of energy only a Michael Jackson concert could summon. But now, after that small, fragile voice had cut through the chaos, the atmosphere had changed entirely. It was still electric, still alive, but it was no longer just adoration for a superstar. It was something deeper, more intimate. Michael felt it too. He stood at center stage, sweat streaking his face, sequins shimmering under the floodlights, chest heaving with exhaustion. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone on stage. He didn't feel like he was carrying the entire weight of expectation by himself. He felt connected, not to an audience, not to a crowd, but to human beings, heart to heart. He looked out over the sea of faces, the ocean of tears, the countless hands raised toward him. His eyes found the child once more, still illuminated by the spotlight. Their cheeks were red, streaked with tears, but their smile was wide, trembling, radiant. And Michael smiled back. That was the moment that melted everyone. Because it wasn't the smile of a star. It wasn't the carefully polished grin of a man trained for cameras. It was soft, vulnerable, human. A smile that said, "I see you. I hear you. You matter." The Jumbotron screens caught it, magnifying that intimate look for 50,000 people. And suddenly, every fan in the stadium felt like it was directed at them too. The roar returned. Not the chaotic frenzy of earlier, but a tidal wave of love. People screamed his name, yes, but they also shouted, "We love you. Thank you. Don't stop." The energy was overwhelming. Michael lifted the microphone slowly, waiting for the noise to dip. When it did, his voice came out raw, cracked, but firm. "Do you know what you've given me tonight?" The crowd roared back, but he shook his head gently, silencing them again. "You've given me love," he said. "Real love. Not for the songs. Not for the dances. For me." His voice trembled. His hand rose to his chest again, pressing against his heart as though trying to hold it in place. "And that's all I ever wanted." The words detonated like fireworks in the hearts of fans. Many screamed. Others sobbed openly. Some just stood frozen, unable to process a vulnerability they were witnessing from the most famous man on earth. Michael turned again toward the child, the one whose voice had broken through. He extended his hand, palm open, and though the distance was too great to close, the gesture was enough. The child mimicked him, reaching back, their small hand trembling in the glow of the spotlight. "You reminded me tonight," Michael said softly, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "That music isn't about perfection. It isn't about being strong all the time. It's about love. It's about believing, and you gave me that." The child cried harder. The audience followed. The wave of emotion rippled outward like rings in water, touching every single person in that stadium. Then, Michael did something that would be replayed on news broadcasts, documentaries, and fan recordings for decades. He lowered the microphone, closed his eyes, and placed both hands over his heart. And then, slowly, he bowed. Not the performer's bow he usually gave at the end of a show. This was different, deeper, longer. A bow of gratitude, of surrender, of acknowledgement. 50,000 people screamed, wept, clapped, and stomped their feet until the ground shook again. Some fell to their knees. Others clasped their hands in prayer. When he stood again, Michael's eyes were wet. His curls clung damply to his cheeks. He raised his hand high into the air, holding the moment as if to freeze it forever. And then, with a nod to the band, he launched into the final song. But this performance was unlike any he had ever given. His voice cracked on the high notes. His timing slipped in places. None of it mattered. In fact, it made the performance unforgettable. Because what came through wasn't the polish of the king of pop. It was the humanity of Michael Jackson. Every lyric sounded like a confession. Every movement carried the weight of gratitude. Fans sang along louder than ever, their voices blending into one colossal choir, lifting him higher with each line. It wasn't Michael carrying the crowd anymore. It was the crowd carrying him. As the final chorus rang out, Michael stepped back from the microphone and let the audience take over. 50,000 voices filled the stadium, shaking the rafters, rolling out into the night sky. He stood at the center, smiling, tears still running freely, soaking in the sound. He let them finish the song for him. And when the last note faded, he whispered into the microphone, barely audible, "Thank you. You melted my heart tonight." The words broke everyone. Fans collapsed into tears. Even members of his band, hardened professionals who'd seen it all, stood backstage wiping their eyes. The dancers huddled together, whispering, "Did you just see that?" Michael took one last look at the child in the spotlight. He blew them a kiss, pressing his gloved fingers to his lips and flicking them outward. The child caught it, hands clutching their chest, sobbing uncontrollably. The crowd roared one last time, louder than anything before, a wall of love that threatened to split the night in half. Michael turned slowly, walking the length of the stage. This time he didn't strut, he didn't moonwalk, he didn't spin. He walked with simple steps, looking into the crowd, memorizing faces. He pressed his hand to his heart again and again, nodding, smiling softly. At the far edge of the stage, he stopped, turned back to face the sea of people, and whispered into the microphone one last time. "Never stop believing. In me, in music, but most of all in yourselves." And then he was gone. The lights went black. The stadium was plunged into silence. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then the tears came. People hugged strangers. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, whispering, "Remember this. You'll never see anything like it again." And they never would, because that night wasn't just another Michael Jackson concert. It wasn't another chapter in the story of the greatest performer alive. It was a night when Michael stopped being untouchable and larger than life, and became human in front of the world. The night a single child's voice melted everyone. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.